I sit alone in my apartment in New Haven, staring out the window at the gray clouds gathering over the city. The distant rumble of thunder barely registers in my mind as I reflect on the journey that led me here. I never thought my life would turn out this way, and yet here I am sitting in a quiet, unfamiliar space, still processing the horrifying truth about my family. Let me start from the beginning. My name is Lyra Caldwell. I'm a 32-year-old accountant with a seemingly average life. Or at least, that's what I thought until everything I believed about my own family was shattered. I had always been the one holding everything together. After my father, Victor, disappeared without a trace. When I was just 17, it was up to me to keep the family afloat. My mother, Delilah, once a successful investigative journalist, had fallen from grace after an infamous scandal, leaving her bitter and resentful. My younger sister, Ivy, well, Ivy. She was always rebellious, always avoiding responsibility, always a little too distant from reality. And then there was me, the quiet, responsible one, who always took on the burden, always tried to make everything work, no matter how hard it became. I loved my family, though. I had to. They were all I had left after my father left us. But things started to change over the past year. The tension was there, subtle at first, like a whisper under the surface of everyday life. My mother's temper was sharper, her words colder. Ivy became more distant, always glued to her phone, barely acknowledging me when I'd try to start a conversation. And me? I was exhausted, physically, mentally, emotionally. I was the one who made sure the bills were paid, the one who kept things running smoothly. Even though Delilah and Ivy contributed nothing but excuses, I tried to ignore the growing sense of unease. I told myself it was just stress. After all, who wouldn't be stressed when they were carrying the weight of an entire family on their shoulders? But deep down, something was off. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being used, that everything I did, every sacrifice I made, was taken for granted. It wasn't until one fateful evening that everything came crashing down. I had been working late, buried in financial reports for the law firm I worked at. It wasn't unusual for me to stay late. I was always the one who took on the toughest cases. But that night, as the clock ticked past 7:00 p.m., something inside me told me to hurry up and leave. I packed up my things quickly, tossed them into my bag, and rushed home. When I arrived, I tried to act normal, just like every other night. I called out to my mom, "I'm home, sorry I'm late again." She barely looked up from the TV, offering her usual half-hearted response. "Don't worry about it, we already ate. There's food in the fridge for you." I gave her a kiss on the cheek, but when my eyes landed on Ivy, sitting in the chair across from the TV, my heart skipped a beat. She barely acknowledged me, a quick wave of her hand before she returned to scrolling on her phone. That was Ivy, always lost in her own world, always detached. I heated up the food Delilah had left for me, but I didn't have much of an appetite. My mind kept racing about the bills piling up, about how I was the only one who seemed to care about our financial situation. I tried to start a conversation with Delilah, but she just shrugged it off. "Expenses go up as you get older," she muttered. "I might have overspent a little this month, but you know how it is." I wanted to argue, to demand more from her, but I couldn't. I never could. Delilah was my mother. Despite everything, I couldn't bring myself to question her. I didn't want to believe that she was taking advantage of me. The next day, something happened that I couldn't ignore. I was at work, as usual, sorting through documents when my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. I answered, expecting it to be a client, but instead, I was greeted by a voice I didn't recognize. "Is this Lyra Caldwell?" the voice asked. "I'm calling from Mirage Life Insurance to confirm that the recent change to your policy's beneficiary has been processed." I froze. A chill ran down my spine as I clutched the phone tighter. "Change of beneficiary?" I repeated, my voice shaking. I didn't authorize any change. The man on the other end of the line didn't seem to notice my panic. "Last month, an application was submitted to change the beneficiaries to Delilah Caldwell and Ivy Caldwell. Your signature is on file." My heart stopped. There was no way. I had never authorized that change. I don't recall making that request," I stammered, the words barely leaving my mouth. "There must be some mistake. I'll look into it." I ended the call, sitting frozen at my desk. The words echoed in my mind, sending waves of nausea through my body. Delilah and Ivy were listed as beneficiaries on my life insurance policy, I had never signed anything, never approved anything. I felt like I was drowning in confusion. I spent the weekend trying to shake off the unease. I told myself it was just a mistake, that I was overthinking things. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. That Saturday, while Delilah and Ivy were out shopping, I decided to clean up the house. It was a routine I often did on weekends, trying to keep everything in order, even when they couldn't be bothered. As I vacuumed through the living room, I noticed something strange, something hidden beneath the edge of the couch. Curious, I crouched down and reached for it, my fingers brushing against the cold metal of an old laptop. It looked like it had been there for years, untouched, forgotten. My heart pounded as I pulled it out, debating whether or not to turn it on. Something in me knew that I shouldn't, but I did anyway. The screen flickered to life, revealing a familiar desktop. No password prompt, no security measures. It was as though it had been waiting for me. I swallowed hard, my hands trembling. It still works, I muttered under my breath, my voice barely audible. As I scrolled through the files, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A chat window open. The group chat. I clicked on it, my fingers moving mechanically as I skimmed through the messages. One message, from 3 months ago, stopped me in my tracks. How much should we set Lyra's life insurance at? We want the payout to be as high as possible, but we need to increase it slowly so it doesn't look suspicious. My breath caught in my throat. I blinked rapidly, hoping that I had misread it, but the next message made it worse. Until then, let's just keep using her like an ATM. We need her savings too. I stared at the screen, my mind spinning. My fingers trembled as I scrolled through more messages, each one more damning than the last. Good call on changing her bank password. She hasn't even noticed the insurance forms are ready. I forged her signature perfectly. I was paralyzed, unable to move. The words were seared into my mind, repeating over and over. This wasn't paranoia. This wasn't a misunderstanding. My own mother, my own sister had been planning to kill me. The room seemed to close in on me as I sat there, staring at the laptop screen. My stomach churned. My hands were shaking, but I couldn't look away. The messages were clear, undeniable. My own mother, Delilah, and my sister, Ivy, had been plotting against me. They hadn't just been taking advantage of me financially. No, this was something far darker. This was a premeditated attempt on my life. I could barely breathe. My thoughts were spiraling, racing in every direction. Could this really be happening? How could I not have seen it? How could I not have noticed the signs? The late-night phone calls I'd overheard between them. The way they'd always acted like everything was fine, all while taking more and more from me. I should have known. I should have figured it out. But I hadn't, and now it was too late. I wanted to scream, to run, to tell someone, but I was paralyzed by fear. I couldn't move, couldn't think straight. How could I tell anyone about this? How could I make them believe me? The police? They'd probably laugh me off, call it a family dispute, tell me to go home. What would I do then? What if they turned the tables on me, made it look like I was the crazy one, the unstable one? My own mother and sister had orchestrated this. And if I went to the authorities, what would stop them from framing me for something I hadn't done? I felt my chest tighten as a wave of nausea hit me. I needed to act. I couldn't just sit here and wait for them to follow through with their plan. No, I had to leave. I had to get out of here before it was too late. But as the minutes dragged on, I couldn't bring myself to move. I kept staring at the screen, reading and rereading the messages, the proof that my entire life had been a lie. The way Delilah and Ivy had been using me as nothing more than a means to an end, a tool to secure their own future. All these years, all my sacrifices, and this was how they repaid me. Suddenly, the sound of the front door creaking open sent a jolt of panic through my body. They were home, Delilah and Ivy. My heart was pounding in my chest as I quickly shoved the laptop back under the couch, my hands trembling as I tried to regain some semblance of calm. Lyra? Delilah's voice rang out from the hallway, calm and collected as always, though I could sense a strange edge in her tone. Where are you? I swallowed hard, forcing myself to speak, to sound like everything was normal. In here, I called back, trying to keep my voice steady. Just cleaning up. The door cracked open, and Delilah poked her head in, giving me one of her signature tired smiles. Well, it's nice that you're cleaning up. Ivy should really do more of that. I smiled weakly, trying to hide the fear bubbling up inside me. Yeah, she should. I glanced over at Ivy, who was now standing in the doorway, looking at me with a bored expression, her phone still glued to her hand. Are you feeling okay? Delilah asked, her eyes narrowing as she took in my pale face. You look a little off. I forced a smile, pushing down the rising wave of panic. I'm fine, I said, my voice sounding hoarse, just a little tired. I'll head to my room now. Good idea, Delilah said, her voice oddly gentle. You should rest. The kindness in her tone sent a cold shiver down my spine. It was all part of the act, wasn't it? Everything was part of the act. She didn't care about me. She didn't care about anything except the money. The money that would come when I was gone. I nodded, walking down the hallway as quickly as I could, my body tense with every step. My mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion, but one thought kept cutting through the chaos. I had to get out of here. Once I reached my room, I closed the door behind me, leaning against it as I tried to steady my breathing. I slid down the door, my legs giving out as the weight of everything hit me all at once. The betrayal, the fear, the uncertainty, it was too much. Tears burned at the corners of my eyes, but I didn't let them fall. Not yet. I couldn't break down. Not until I was out of here. The plan had to be perfect. I couldn't make any mistakes. I couldn't risk them finding out what I knew. I had to leave. Now. I stood up, grabbing my bag and quickly packing the essentials. My ID, some cash, my phone. I couldn't take everything, but I could take enough to get away. To get far enough from Delilah and Ivy. My hands moved quickly, almost mechanically, as I threw a few clothes into the bag and zipped it up. But just as I was about to grab my phone, it buzzed. A message. From Delilah. My thumb hovered over the screen, my heart skipping a beat. Should I open it? Should I risk seeing what she had to say? No, I couldn't. I couldn't risk anything. I quickly turned off my phone, pulling the battery out to make sure they couldn't track me. I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me as I held the battery in my hands. There was no turning back now. I had to leave, and I had to do it fast. I wasn't just running from my family. I was running from a life I had known, a life that had been built on lies. The thought of leaving everything behind my home, my family, was unbearable, but I had no choice. I couldn't stay here. Not with them. Not with the knowledge of what they had planned for me. I looked at the clock. It was 3:00 a.m. I had a few hours before Delilah and Ivy would wake up. Enough time to get away, to put distance between me and them. I grabbed the bag and slipped out of the room, careful not to make a sound. I moved quietly through the house, every creak of the floorboards sending a fresh wave of panic through me. I was almost at the door when I heard a noise behind me. A footstep. I froze, my heart in my throat. But it was just the wind. The door was slightly ajar, swaying with the breeze. I exhaled, my shoulders sagging with relief. But it was short-lived. I knew I couldn't afford to let my guard down. Not now. I opened the door as quietly as I could, slipping into the night. The cold air hit me like a slap in the face, sharp and biting, but it felt like freedom. For the first time in what felt like forever, I could breathe. I was free, but for how long? I didn't know what came next, but I couldn't stay in this nightmare any longer. I walked faster, heading toward the nearest bus station, hoping it was far enough to throw them off. But deep down, I knew this was just the beginning of something darker. And I wasn't sure if I was ready for it. The streets were quieter than I expected. Maybe it was the time of night, or maybe it was because, in the back of my mind, I was already questioning whether I could ever return to any sense of normalcy. Every step I took felt like I was walking away from the only life I'd ever known. But then again, what life was that? A life built on lies, deception, and a family that was willing to end it all for money. I kept moving, my steps echoing in the silent streets as I walked toward the bus station. My bag felt heavier with every step, not because of its contents, but because of the weight of the truth I was carrying. I had to leave, and I had to do it now. The more I thought about it, the more surreal it seemed. Delilah, my mother, the woman who had raised me, who had always told me she loved me, was planning to murder me. And Ivy, my own sister, had been complicit in it. The betrayal was suffocating, and I couldn't stop replaying the messages I had seen on that laptop. The cold, calculated words, the detailed plan. It was all there, but what was the real reason behind it? Sure, the money from my life insurance policy would set them up for life, but there had to be something more. There had to be some deeper, darker motivation. Why me? I was their family. I had been the one holding everything together, and yet, they were willing to sacrifice me without hesitation. As I approached the bus station, I realized I had no real destination in mind. I just knew I had to get away. I didn't care where I went, as long as it was far from Chicago, far from Delilah and Ivy. I could feel the weight of their eyes on me, even though they weren't there. I could feel them watching, waiting for me to make a mistake. I reached the counter, my heart pounding in my chest as I asked for a one-way ticket. The woman behind the counter looked up at me, her eyes lingering for just a second too long. I wondered if she saw something in my face, some flicker of fear that gave me away. But she didn't ask any questions. She just sold me the ticket, and I paid for it with cash. I didn't even look at the destination on the ticket until I sat down on the bus. New Haven, Connecticut. I didn't know anyone there, didn't have any family or friends. It didn't matter. It was far enough. It was the first place that came to mind when I was forced to make a decision. As the bus rumbled to life and pulled away from the station, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of freedom wash over me. For the first time in what felt like forever, I was in control. I was free from the toxic grip of my mother and sister, free from the life they had planned for me. I wasn't sure where I was going, but I knew it had to be away from them. The hours on the bus were a blur. I kept my eyes on the road, trying to block out the thoughts that kept creeping into my mind. The fact that they would come after me, the fact that Delilah and Ivy might even be able to track me down. I couldn't let myself think about that. Not now. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I froze. It was a message from Delilah. "Where are you?" "We're worried." I could feel my pulse quicken as I read the message. I wanted to throw the phone out the window, to disconnect completely, but I knew I had to keep it. At least for now. I couldn't afford to be completely isolated. I didn't respond. I couldn't. It was too dangerous. I powered the phone down, taking out the battery just like I had at home. They couldn't track me if I didn't give them anything to work with. I stared out the window, watching the city lights blur into the distance as the bus made its way into the unknown. It was a strange feeling, knowing I was running from something so sinister and not knowing if I would ever return to the life I had once known. My thoughts kept drifting back to Victor, my father, the man who had disappeared without a trace all those years ago. I had always wondered why he had left us, why he hadn't fought harder to stay. Now, I am beginning to understand. Maybe he had been running too. Maybe he had seen something in Delilah that I hadn't. Maybe he had seen the same darkness in her that I had finally uncovered. As the bus sped through the night, I made a vow to myself. I wouldn't let them win. I wouldn't let them turn me into a victim, into someone who cowered in fear. I would find a way to fight back. I would make sure Delilah and Ivy paid for what they tried to do to me. The only problem was that I didn't know how. Not yet. But I would figure it out. I had to. The bus ride was long, but I didn't sleep. I couldn't afford to. My mind was too occupied with everything that had happened, with what was waiting for me in the future. What was I supposed to do now? What kind of life would I have without them? I didn't have the answers yet, but one thing was for sure. I wasn't going to let Delilah and Ivy take any more from me. I was going to take my life back, piece by piece. And no matter where I ended up, I was going to make sure they couldn't hurt me anymore. The bus finally pulled into the terminal in New Haven, just as the first light of dawn began to break through the horizon. I stepped off the bus, feeling a strange combination of exhaustion and adrenaline coursing through me. My feet hit the cold pavement, and I realized for the first time in hours that I had no real plan. I hadn't thought past getting away. Now, I was in an unfamiliar city, with no family, no friends, no connections. I took a deep breath and glanced around. The air was brisk and sharp, filled with the scent of fresh rain, and something else, something unfamiliar. I needed to get my bearings, but I couldn't afford to waste time. I couldn't stay in one place for too long. I needed to figure out where to go next, and more importantly, how to get out of this nightmare. I walked through the terminal, past tired travelers and people heading out for their own journeys. My mind was clouded with so many thoughts, so many fears, but there was one that kept resurfacing over and over again. What now? I found myself at a small coffee shop near the bus station. It was quiet, barely anyone inside at this early hour. I ordered a black coffee and sat by the window, hoping the normalcy of it all would ground me, even just for a moment. But the quiet only made the knot in my stomach tighten. I couldn't stop thinking about them, Delilah, Ivy, the plot they'd so carefully orchestrated. I had seen their words, their plan. I had seen the truth, and I couldn't unsee it. I was still trying to process what it meant for me, for my future, for my sense of self. Was I always just a pawn in their game? Was I always going to be the one who held it all together, while they used me for their own purposes? A buzz from my phone brought me back to the present, but I hesitated before checking it. It could be them. I didn't want to know if it was, but I had to. I couldn't let fear control me now. It was a message from an unknown number. Lyra, it's Thomas. Call me when you get this. It's important. My heart skipped a beat. Thomas? My mind raced. Who was Thomas? And why was he reaching out to me? But I couldn't ignore it. I had to know what this was about. I quickly dialed the number. The phone rang for a few moments before a gruff voice answered. Lyra, I'm glad you called. We don't have much time. Who is this? I asked, my voice shaky despite my attempt to sound composed. Thomas Henderson. I'm an old friend of your father's, he said, pausing for a moment. Listen, Lyra, your dad Victor, he asked me to look out for you. I know about what's going on with Delilah and Ivy. You need to be careful. I froze. Victor. My father had disappeared without a word years ago, leaving no trace behind. I had spent so many years wondering why. Why did he leave? Why couldn't he even send a letter? But now, hearing this man's voice, everything started to make sense. What do you know? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I've been following your situation for a while. Ever since your father contacted me, he's been trying to protect you from afar. But now that you know the truth, you're in real danger. Delilah and Ivy aren't the only ones involved. There are people much bigger than them, people who will stop at nothing to get what they want. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. What do you mean? I asked, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to stay calm. I can't explain everything right now, but you're tangled up in something much larger than your family's greed, Thomas said, his tone becoming more urgent. I'm coming to New Haven. We need to meet. I can help you. I wasn't sure what to think. Who could I trust anymore? But there was something in Thomas's voice, something that made me believe he knew more than he was letting on. My father knew him. That had to count for something. Where do we meet? I asked, already knowing that my life had just become more complicated than I could have ever imagined. Meet me at the old library, on Maple Street. It's a public place. I'll be there in an hour. The call ended abruptly, and I stared at the phone in my hand. It was a lifeline. Or a trap. I didn't know which yet, but I had no choice. I couldn't keep running forever. I stood up from the coffee shop, my mind spinning as I made my way out into the cold morning air. The city felt unfamiliar. Too quiet, too cold. I wasn't sure what I was walking into, but I knew I had to find out. I needed answers. I walked to the library, my eyes constantly scanning the streets for any sign of danger. It felt like I was being watched. Every person I passed seemed to be staring a little too long, their eyes lingering just a bit too much. But there was no one following me, not that I could see. When I arrived at the library, it was still early, the doors still locked. I stood outside, waiting, my mind racing. What if this was a mistake? What if Thomas was just like Delilah and Ivy, just another person who wanted something from me? But there was something that told me he wasn't. I couldn't explain it, but I had to trust him. Finally, the door creaked open, and there he was, Thomas Henderson. He was tall, with graying hair and a weathered face, like someone who had seen too much of the world's darkness. He looked at me, his gaze steady. Lyra, he said, his voice low. You're deeper than you realize, but we'll get you out of this. I nodded, my heart still racing. I had no idea what this man was about to tell me, but one thing was clear. The storm wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The cold air from outside hung in the library, making me shiver as I stepped inside. Thomas closed the door behind us, locking it with a click. It was quiet here. The only sounds were the soft hum of the lights overhead and the distant echo of my own heartbeat in my ears. The tension in the room was palpable, thick with the weight of unspoken truths. Thomas motioned for me to sit at a nearby table, and I did, my fingers still trembling as I clutched my bag tightly. I had no idea what to expect from this man, from the situation I had walked into. All I knew was that everything I thought I knew had been turned upside down. Lyra, Thomas began, his voice gruff but steady. Your father, Victor, he's not just an ordinary man. He got involved with some dangerous people a long time ago. I know you think he abandoned you, but he didn't. He was trying to protect you, in his own way. I felt a knot tighten in my chest. What do you mean? What are you talking about? My voice wavered, but I forced myself to stay composed. You see, Delilah, Ivy, they weren't just after your life insurance money. There's something bigger at play here. Your family has been tied up with a group called Knox for years. They're powerful, ruthless, and they don't hesitate to get what they want. Your father tried to escape them. He tried to protect you by disappearing, but they found him anyway. The words hit me like a ton of bricks. I sat there in silence, trying to process what he had just said. Knox? A powerful organization? How could my family be involved in something so sinister? Why would they target me? Why me? I asked, almost pleading for an answer. The confusion and fear I had been carrying for days now seemed to crash over me all at once. Because you're the key, Thomas said, his eyes darkening. Your father knew something about Knox, something that could destroy them. They didn't want him to reveal it, and they certainly don't want you to find out. They've been using your family to get to him. Delilah and Ivy, they've been manipulated, just like you. They don't know the full truth, not yet. I couldn't breathe. The weight of his words hung heavy in the air. I had always thought of my family as flawed but loved ones who cared about me. But now, everything I had known was a lie. My mother and sister weren't just greedy, they were pawns in a much larger game. You're telling me that my mother and sister are victims? I asked, still struggling to wrap my head around it. That they don't know what they're really involved in? Not entirely, Thomas replied. Delilah knew what she was doing when she tried to kill you. She thought the money from your life insurance policy would get her out of her debts, that it would solve all of her problems. But Ivy? She's been manipulated. She doesn't understand the full extent of the danger she's in. But if Knox gets to her, if they think she knows too much, they'll come for her next. The thought that Ivy might be another victim, another pawn, shook me to my core. She was my sister, after all. But she had still been part of the plot. How could I reconcile that? How could I just forgive her? And my father? I asked, the question slipping from my lips before I even realized what I was asking. What happened to him? Where is he now? Victor is alive, but barely. He's been in hiding for years, under constant threat from Knox. He didn't want you to get caught in this mess, so he cut all ties with you. He thought if he could keep you safe, you wouldn't have to know the truth. But it looks like you've stumbled right into it. I felt a wave of anger rush through me. All these years, I had wondered why my father had abandoned me, why he had disappeared without a word. But now I know. He had been trying to protect me from the very thing that had torn my life apart. What do I do now? I whispered, almost to myself. How do I fight this? How do I get out of this alive? Thomas sat across from me, his expression serious but calm. You don't have much time. Knox will find you if they haven't already. They'll come after you, after all of us. But you can fight. You have a choice. You can expose them. You can bring down everything they've worked so hard to build. I didn't know if I was ready for this. But as the weight of Thomas's words settled in, something shifted inside me. I couldn't keep running forever. I couldn't let Delilah and Ivy, or anyone else, control my life any longer. It was time to take back what was mine. But how? And at what cost? I'm in, I said, my voice steady now, despite the storm inside me. I'll do whatever it takes to stop them. Thomas nodded, his eyes sharp with understanding. Good. Because you're not alone in this anymore. We'll figure this out, together. The days after meeting Thomas were a blur. Every waking moment felt like I was teetering on the edge of something massive, something I couldn't escape. The danger, the secrets, everything had started to unfold faster than I could have ever imagined. But now, as I stood across from Thomas in that small, dimly lit office, I realized that the only way out of this was to face it head on. We had to bring Knox down. We don't have much time, Thomas said, his voice low, the urgency in his eyes undeniable. They're on to us. We've been careful, but I'm not sure how much longer we can stay under their radar. We need to act now. I nodded, my mind racing. Every plan I'd made up until now had been about running, escaping. But now? Now it was about something else entirely. It was about fighting back. Thomas had been working on gathering evidence against Knox, but there were still pieces of the puzzle missing. The most crucial part? Delilah. My mother. She knew something. She had to. She was the linchpin in all of this. If we could get her to confess, everything would crumble. But getting to her wouldn't be easy. She was tangled up in Knox too. And if they got wind of what we were doing, well, it could be over before it even began. We're going to have to confront her, Thomas said, his tone grim. But we need leverage. We need proof, and we need her to believe that we have it. I felt a cold chill run through me. Confronting Delilah, my own mother, wasn't something I ever thought I'd do, but I had no choice. She was part of this, and she had to be stopped. There was no other way. Thomas handed me a flash drive. This contains everything we need to nail Knox. Evidence, documents, financial transactions, everything that connects them to your mother. You can't do this alone, Lyra. I know this is hard, but you have to face her. I stared at the flash drive in my hand, the weight of it heavier than any object I had ever held. It wasn't just a device, it was my future. The future of everyone caught in this mess, resting on a few lines of code. Where do we start? I asked, trying to steady my nerves. Your mother's office. It's where most of the important documents are. We'll plant this there, and when she finds it, we'll be waiting. But Lyra, Thomas paused, his gaze hardening. You have to be ready. This isn't just about taking down a criminal organization. It's about bringing down everything she's built, the lies, the manipulation, the people who thought they could control you. I swallowed, nodding. It was time. I had to be ready to confront not just Delilah, but the version of myself I had been living as for so long, the one who thought family could never betray you, the one who never questioned her place in the world. The night was creeping in as we drove through the streets, the city fading away behind us. My heart thudded in my chest as I thought about what awaited us. This wasn't just a confrontation with Delilah. This was a reckoning, a fight for my future, for my freedom. We arrived at her office building just before midnight. I didn't even hesitate when Thomas parked the car. I knew what I had to do. The fear was still there, sitting in the pit of my stomach, but there was something else now. A fire. A drive to stop the nightmare. I slipped into the building, the security guard already on a break. As Thomas and I made our way up to the top floor, Delilah's office was as cold and clinical as everything else in her life. Beautiful, expensive, but empty. I could almost feel her presence in the air, like she was always lurking just out of sight. I inserted the flash drive into her computer. It was a simple action, but as the screen flickered to life, it felt like the most important thing I'd ever done. Now we wait, Thomas whispered, his voice tight with anticipation. Time seemed to stretch out as we hid in the shadows, waiting for Delilah to return. Every minute that passed felt like an eternity. I kept replaying everything in my head, the messages on Ivy's laptop, the years of betrayal, the plan to kill me. And then, the door opened. Delilah walked in, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. I could feel her presence, even before she spoke. Lyra? Her voice was sharp, but I could hear the tension beneath it. She had no idea what we had just set in motion. I stepped out of the shadows, my voice steady, but my heart pounding. It's over, Delilah. Her eyes widened, and for a moment I saw the fear in them, real fear. Not the manipulative, controlling persona she'd always worn, but something raw, something she could no longer hide. You don't know what you're doing, she spat, her face contorted with rage. You can't stop this! You don't understand. I understand more than you think, I interrupted, holding up the flash drive. This is over. You've been playing a dangerous game, but it ends now. I'm not just your daughter anymore. I'm someone who's going to make sure you pay for everything. Delilah looked at the flash drive, her eyes narrowing in horror, but it was too late. The evidence was out, and there was no turning back now. You're going to regret this, Lyra, she hissed, but I could see the fear in her eyes. She knew the walls were closing in. The game was over. The next morning, Delilah and Ivy were arrested. The trial was swift, and Knox, the powerful organization that had been lurking in the shadows, was exposed for all to see. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about justice, about taking back control of my life. As the years passed, I moved on. I found peace, not by forgetting, but by reclaiming everything that was mine. I built a new life, one free from the shadows of the past, and for the first time in years, I could breathe. I was free.